Her most recent book is Jane Austen's Inspiration, Beloved Friend Anne Lefroy, published 2019. So you can all see, or hopefully you can all see Judith's screen now. So her talk is Women and Stoicism. Please take it away, Judith.
Thanks to Charlene and everyone for suggesting that I speak on this topic today. And Sarah's presentation is a very hard act to follow. I think my presentation actually fits in rather well with it, so I hope you can stay with me. I've also chosen to approach this topic in a particular way because it's such a big topic that I felt I had to narrow it down a bit, but I hope we can address some of the other aspects in the discussion. So I started by looking at the question, did the Stoics support women in a way that we would recognise? Only to find that it's been a hotly contested issue. So on the yes side, we have heavy hitters such as Martha Nussbaum and Elizabeth Asimus. And on the no side, there is among others David M. Engel, also a formidable authority, who has argued that where the surviving Stoic writings seem to promote women's virtue, all they are really promoting are the traditional pathway of marriage, homemaking, and above all, children. In an article discussed at length by Massimo Pigliucci, most recently Scott Aiken and Emily Gill Rutherford have censured the ancient Stoics severely for their failure to be modern feminists. Now it seems to me that this yes they were, no they weren't approach is not only supremely unproductive, because this kind of historical question never gets resolved one way or the other, but it's unnecessarily limiting. And I also think that questions such as this one from the Routledge Companion to Feminist Philosophy, chapter on ancient Greek philosophy, represents the same kind of failure. I'd just point out too, in the Routledge Companion to Feminist Philosophy, chapter on ancient Greek philosophy, there is no mention of the Stoics. It's entirely about Plato and Aristotle. So assembling banks of quotes from the surviving works of ancient authors to indicate on the one hand their openness to female achievement, or on the other their ingrained misogyny, misses some key points. And among these is that the philosophers of the Roman periods, I will focus on them rather than the early Greek Stoics because the evidence around those is so fragmentary, were entirely integrated in the values of their wider society. And this was particularly true of the Stoics. In other words, Stoic views about virtue were, I consider, Roman views about virtue hyperdeveloped. Of course, that's not an original observation. A.A. Long has pointed it out, and David Sedley puts it in the converse way. It is often remarked that the value system of patrician Romans made them natural Stoics. So these virtues were the classic Platonic quartet inherited from Athens by generations of Romans: wisdom, self-control, justice, and courage, but with a distinctively Roman twist, as Sarah has emphasised, which included, and I hope to show, resistance to arbitrary and unjust power, and that women were very much able and expected to develop and exhibit these virtues. Hadot tells us that this attitude was a kind of family tradition in which the women often took part. I'll just quickly point out that the image here is of Salone and Matidia. Now we know that Hadrian was not the most heterosexual of emperors, and he had an unhappy marriage to Vibia Sabina, but he got on very well with his mother-in-law. So the women who did take part in this tradition could be and were celebrated alongside great men in the canon of the mighty dead, to echo Matt's wonderful phrase from yesterday. Now the text I want to focus on today, which I hope will prove my point to you, is the splendid Laudatio Turiae, the eulogy for Turia, put up by her grieving husband after her death. We don't even know if that was her name, but it's convenient to call her this. So Turia was a woman who lived in the 1st century BCE in a time of intermittent civil war. Such periods call forth heroism, and it is no overstatement to say that Turia was a heroine. And I'll try to read Turia's story through the frame of Roman and Stoic virtue, rather than from a perspective limited by our current preoccupations. An important point which relates to Hadot's insistence that we attend to the genre forms of ancient literature is that the inscription is in the second person and addressed to Turia directly in the tradition of the Roman funeral oration. This gives the text an immediacy like that of a letter. such as Seneca's to Lucilius. And in this case, the effect, more profoundly than through a letter to the living, is to pierce the barrier thrown up by death. It thus may approximate, as nearly as more philosophical texts, to what Haddo insists are spiritual exercises. So Turia's husband recounts the story of her life and her troubles. To start with, when she was very young, Turia's parents were murdered, probably in a political hit. Assisted by her sister and brother-in-law, Turia achieved justice in the court system for her parents, which meant that she and her sister had access to their inheritance. It is surprising to find a young girl having so much agency. Turia must have had a deep sense of what was justly owed to herself and her sister, and a determination to pursue it. As one recent writer says, Turia had all the virtues of the ideal lawyer: presence of mind, persistence and resolve, sense of duty, devotion and loyalty. So this brings me to another point, general point to do with assessing the degree to which Roman society can be considered feminist or not. If we were to compare it with our own early 21st century Anglophone society, clearly the Roman culture appears very restrictive in regard to women's roles. But let us recall that even in our society, women have only had the vote within the last 100 years. Women have only joined the wider workforce in large numbers since the Second World War. And as Sarah showed us, it's within our lifetimes, or lifetimes of some of us, that basic rights, such as taking part in a public event, have been accorded to women. So I think a far more appropriate comparand society would be an earlier culture. Now, the one with which I'm most familiar is the long 18th century in England. I can't think of a case in that time and place where a young girl, equivalent in social rank to Turia, had been able to do what she did. Young women in that society were unable to travel, act, or undertake legal action on their own behalf. And it should also be remembered that, as in Rome, middle and upper class girls and boys were subject to arranged marriages in general. This was also true of many European societies until the early 19th century at best, and is true of many societies today. And if we're thinking of Turia as an ideal lawyer, we need to recall that it was not until the 1880s that women were permitted to study law in most European countries, and not until the 20th century that women began to practice law. So this kind of adjusted comparison makes classical Roman society look relatively open to female agency. And not even in our own time has any utopian vision of complete gender equality been achieved. The versions created by Plato and supposedly by Zeno were as promising and practical as most utopias, that is, not at all. Marcus himself, the Stoic in absolute power, was no utopian, recognizing that positive change is a very slow process full of compromises with human nature. It's also worth pointing out again that of the only 3 surviving inscribed Laudationes from the Roman world are all dedicated to celebrating the lives of women. So Turia, the one I'm talking about today, one for a woman called Murdia, and the one for Matidia, Hadrian's mother-in-law. So if this is a representative sample of the vast lost iceberg of the genre, perhaps we need to tweak our perception of female roles. To return to that time, political chaos was not done with Turia and the man she was to marry. While she was in her 20s, in 43 BCE, her husband was proscribed by the regime of the Second Triumvirate, the power bloc consisting of warlords Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, later Augustus, who used the memory of the murdered Julius Caesar as a reason for their own long drawn-out political revenge. Now, proscription in English is a kind of a boring word. But if we translate it as billboarding, we get a bit more of a sense of the force of it. It meant people who were considered troublemakers, or simply wealthy, or their relatives, or people against whom others might have a grudge, for whatever reason, were publicly named, literally had their names put up in public as outlaws and could be killed or exiled, their property forfeit to the regime. So it was a case of horrific injustice against multiple individuals. There was a reward of thousands of drachma for killing people on the list. Widows of the proscribed could not inherit their executed husband's property, nor could they remarry. So Turia's husband was proscribed. We don't know why. He doesn't seem to have been an intellectual. Some of the scholarly attention paid to this text has been snooty about his lack of Latin style. He was no Cicero or Seneca, put it that way. But we do know that several philosophers were targeted in this present. Rome's greatest philosopher, Cicero, and his brother Quintus were murdered. We also know of a philosopher of the Cynic school, Marcus Aurelius, a follower of the Stoic Cato, who in the true Cynic style had given everybody a piece of his mind and made himself a target. He too was executed as part of this purge. And we also need to recall, as Hadot emphasises, that in antiquity, being a philosopher was not a matter of having attended some classes or having studied philosophical theories. It was a matter of living a philosophical life, which included acting with virtue in the face of life's challenges. So in this new crisis, with her, Turia responded with her trademark courage and ingenuity. She protected her husband in a secret location, keeping him supplied with necessaries. Bear that in mind, as the close contact of a proscribed man, Turia herself would have been persona non grata, losing friends and support, while anyone who might have previously had any grievance against her would have been on her trail too. Not only that, Turia personally approached the triumvir Lepidus and persuaded him to revoke her husband's proscription, which was a most unusual outcome. Not before, her husband writes, she was assaulted by Lepidus's entourage. It's a curious fact that of the historians who have examined Turia's story, several have focused on whether this episode was likely to have been factual or not, because, and I'm paraphrasing, Lepidus was the nice triumvir. I find this completely naive. Anyone who rose to the top of a bloody junta in the 1st century BCE was quite capable of having his bodyguards use violence on a politically unwelcome woman, or at least turning a blind eye when they did so. So with her husband back, did he and Turia live happily ever after? No, Fortuna was not done with them yet. Turia could not have children. Now, even in our society, women often feel that there's a stigma around infertility, even though we now know, as the ancients did not, that as at least as often as a problem with the male partner's fertility. Imagine in that society, which was thoroughly focused on the family, both nuclear and extended, what a sadness and shame must have been felt. It was so Turia had a suggestion, practical as her suggestions always were. And in a remarkable case of self-sacrifice, she proposed to her husband that he divorce her and marry a woman who could bear children, while she, Turia, would help out with the family. Again, imagine a Roman woman, always aware that her ultimate role was to be the mother of a family, a matrona, voluntarily resigning that status, yet again to promote her husband's well-being. It is an extraordinary act of virtue. Turia's husband was appalled. He admits that he flared up and nearly went out of his mind. It is as if we're listening in to this most sensitive of issues being canvassed within a marriage. We marvel at Turia for her offer of sacrifice, and we love her husband for rejecting it passionately. They did then enjoy a long and happy marriage together. How long, we're not quite sure. Scholars differ on the number of exes. Was it 31 or 41 years? On Turia's death, her devastated husband put up this inscription, the largest, even if complete, private inscription surviving from the Roman world. Pieces of it have been found scattered around various locations in Rome. It was first transcribed, or parts of it was transcribed in the 16th century, first commented upon in the 18th century, and one of the first scholars to give a thorough treatment was the great German historian Theodor Mommsen in the 1860s. So how is it that in 2014, a historian could still say that the Laudatio Turiae was a surprisingly underexplored resource? In that year, 2014, as it happened, a full length about Turia finally appeared. So why has it been underexplored? Perhaps because historians as a class, unlike, say, adherents of the Stoic philosophy, are not in general very comfortable in dealing with passionate expressions of love and virtue. Which brings me to a point I made earlier. Turia, in her wisdom, her courage, her justice, and her humility, was an exemplar of the virtues which were so dear to the Stoics. And two texts are very pertinent here. The first is Musonius Rufus' short essay, should daughters receive the same training as sons? Musonius states boldly that there is not one set of virtues for a man and another for a woman is easy to perceive. He argues that self-control is essential for everyone, male and female alike. Dia garso frosunes mones ec fugamon acolasiam. Only through self-control do we, men and women on the same team here, avoid akalasia. How do we translate that word? So critical in the study of virtue from Plato onwards. Early translations, the one of Lutz, that's readily available online, gives the word wantonness, which of course is completely unsatisfactory, being both obsolete and inaccurate. On the other hand, a more word-for-word translation, only through self-control do we avoid the lack of self-control, is relatively accurate, but otherwise uninformative. Let's translate it here as only through self-control do we avoid chaos, because that at least captures some of the force involved. Acolasia in the individual represented a destructive threat to social order in general. Musonius goes on to advocate for courage, enabled by self-control, which must be prior, as equally important for women as for men. I quoted this passage in full because it's beautiful. It's relevant to note here that the word he uses for courage, andreia, which of course is cognate with aner, the commonest Greek word for man. So in saying it's appropriate to women as well, Musonius is making a strong statement. Perhaps someone may say that courage, andreia, is a virtue appropriate to men only. That is not so. And he goes on. It's as if he is talking about Turia here. Even more so further on when he says, and most of all, the child who is trained properly, whether boy or girl, must be accustomed to endure hardship, not to fear death, not to be disheartened in the face of any misfortune. We don't think of Musonius as a great stylist, but he rises to rhetorical heights here with this threefold repetition. And even more pertinently to Turia, in his essay that women too should study philosophy, Musonius points out that the woman who has studied philosophy won't let herself be bullied. She will not be intimidated by anyone because he is of noble birth or powerful or rich or even by Zeus if he is a tyrant. Turia embodies virtue to such an extent that at least one scholar has pointed out that she and her husband stand in a position where the gender roles have been reversed. On this reading, Turia is celebrated for exhibiting traditionally masculine virtues such as courage, while her husband emphasizes his own fragility and inadequacy without her support. Of course, we know that Musonius's emphasis on women as virtuous agents in difficult times may well reflect his own experience. And he was no stranger to the kind of trouble in which Turia and her husband had found themselves some decades earlier. We know that Musonius, already established as a teacher of Stoicism at Rome at that time, was banished on trumped-up charges of having been involved in the conspiracy of Piso against Nero. And he also fell foul of Nero's successors, returning finally to Rome only on the death of Vespasian. Which brings you to another highly relevant Stoic text, and it came up yesterday. In the beautiful opening paragraphs of the Meditations, Marcus lists the people he learned from the living and learned about the late, even got to know, and he uses the verb gnonai, as if the great dead were living friends to whom his brother had introduced him. From my brother Severus to love my kin, and to love truth, and to love justice, and through him I learned to know Thrasea, Ovidius, Cato, Dion, Brutus, and from him I received the idea of a state in which there is the same law for all, a state administered with regard to equal rights and equal freedom of speech, and the idea of a kingly government which respects most of all the freedom of the governed. In invoking these names and values, Marcus is underlining his commitment to the unbroken tradition of Stoic resistance to unfair rule, and by implication, undertaking that his own regime will not be like that. As Marcus also reminds us at Book 9, number 1, he who commits an injustice commits an impiety. Now, when Turia was pushing back against the unjust apparatus of the Second Triumvirate, she was, I contend, at a higher reach of the same virtuous current. In conclusion, then, we are at a stage in the revival of Stoicism, of modern Stoicism, as we may find a name which dates somewhat quickly, where our historiography and perhaps our philosophy have come full circle. In a 2018 article, Anthony Grafton has shown how the discovery of Diogenes Laertius' lives of the eminent philosophers during the Renaissance led to an explosion of interest in the philosophers whose biographies and surviving doctrines were described. And this year, Ryan Holiday and Stephen Hanselman have released Lives with the Stoics, potted biographies of relevant figures in the Stoic tradition. I predict that we will see another blossoming of philosophy told through biography of both men and women. Stoicism is particularly adapted for this biographical term because of its emphasis on action, public involvement, and lived virtue. Notably, one of the people included in Holiday and Hanselman is Portia Catonis, Cato's daughter and the wife of Brutus, who was involved in the plotting of the murder of Julius Caesar. It seems to me that my Turia Mea, is just as worthy of inclusion in a future edition. And maybe we will see historians being more comfortable with love and virtue. Marcus draws our attention to the role of love in nature. Here's hoping, because that, after all, is why we're gathered here, to grow in virtue ourselves through reading, talking, thinking, and write about, as Marcus puts it, getting to know the brave, wise, and just women and men of the past. Thank you.